In this lesson, I'll show you how to create a new virtual machine from scratch in Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V. This is most likely the first thing that a new Hyper-V admin would want to do once the Hyper-V role has been enabled. So with that, let's get started. There's really two different ways to create a new Hyper-V virtual machine. The first one is to import a virtual machine from a physical to virtual conversion, or to import one through a virtual appliance that you might have downloaded. Let's say, for example, from the Microsoft website. So with the import option, you're already bringing an existing operating system, configuration, and most likely applications from another source into Hyper-V as a virtual machine. It could be through a conversion of a physical server in your data center into this virtual machine, or it could be from a download, let's say off the internet, of another virtual machine that's already been created. Now, the second way to create a new virtual machine in Hyper-V is to create one from scratch, and that's what I'll be showing you how to do in this lesson. The steps to create that new Hyper-V virtual machine are to assign a name and location, assign memory to the virtual machine, virtual memory, configure networking, what virtual network will the virtual machine connect to a virtual hard disk and potentially create one, define any installation options for the operating system, and then click Go. From there, the installation of the guest operating system in the virtual machine will start. And you could provide that operating system by putting a physical DVD in the Hyper-V host, or most likely by pointing the virtual machine to an ISO file, which you can download for any operating system out there, including Windows or Linux. So with that, let's go over to Hyper-V Manager and get started creating our first Hyper-V virtual machine. Creating our first Hyper-V virtual machine is easy. All we have to do is go over here to New underneath the Actions menu and click Virtual Machine. This brings up the New Virtual Machine wizard. It's this wizard that's going to guide us through the process of creating our first virtual machine. Now, if you want to take the one-click approach to creating a new virtual machine, on this wizard screen, they point out all you have to do is really click Finish right here. And there we go. We created our first virtual machine. I'll click on the virtual machine here. Of course, it doesn't yet have an operating system, but we could give it a name like Windows 8 Test. So there you go. That's how easy it is to create a virtual machine in Hyper-V Server, and it can be done with just one click. At this point, you might be wondering, well, why the heck do I need an instructor to tell me how to do that? All I had to do was click Finish, and we created a virtual machine. Well, there's more to it than that, as you might guess. If we go back here and we click New again and click Virtual Machine, there's actually a number of different options here that if we go down and click Next, we'll be guided through the process. So let's call this new virtual machine we're creating Win 2012-1. This is going to be our first Windows Server 2012 test machine. And note here that you can specify on a per virtual machine basis a new location to store that virtual machine. Otherwise, it's just going to take the default that's specified over in the Hyper-V settings for this host. If I click Next here, now we're asked how much memory we'd like to allocate to this virtual machine. Of course, this is virtual memory from the Hyper-V host that will be allocated to the virtual machine. It tells us here that we can specify anywhere between 8 megabyte, which is the minimum for a virtual machine, all the way up to 22,892 megabytes, or about 22 gigabytes, which happens to be very close to the maximum amount of memory on this Hyper-V host. Now, a common question you may be asking at this point is, how much memory should I configure on my virtual machines? How do I know which virtual machine gets what amount of virtual memory? And that is a very good question. In many cases, the amount of virtual memory is configured based on the amount of memory recommended by the application vendor, or however much memory was on the physical server when it was migrated into Hyper-V. However, in many cases, that amount of memory just isn't correct. It's way too much memory for what's really needed by the virtual machine. What I recommend is to err on the conservative side and actually allocate perhaps a little bit more memory than the virtual machine may initially need, and then you can come back and monitor the memory utilization over time and slowly reduce that amount of memory to reclaim it without causing negative application performance. Now, in the real world, what I've found is most virtual machines actually need far less memory than what's configured on a similar physical server. For example, a Windows Server 2008 system that's acting as, let's say, an Exchange server, when virtualized, may only need 4 or 6 or 8 gigabytes of RAM. It's going to need significantly less RAM once running as a virtual machine. And there's performance sizing tools out there from third parties as well as from Microsoft that can help you to properly size, or right size as they call it, your virtual machines. Now you may be wondering about this checkbox down here that says to use dynamic memory. This is a really interesting feature of Hyper-V Server where, let's say that I allocated 4 gigs of RAM to this new Windows 2012 server, but over time that server needed more RAM. I could actually go in here and, with the virtual machine running, reconfigure the memory to, let's say, 8 gigabytes of RAM, doubling the RAM, and without shutting down the guest operating system, that RAM would be dynamically added to the virtual machine. So in effect, this is a hot add of memory to a running virtual machine, but there are some operating system and application requirements that you should read more about before using the dynamic memory feature in production. I'll go ahead and uncheck that and click Next here. And now let's talk about networking, or virtual networking in the case of a virtual machine. So you're creating a virtual machine. It needs to connect to the network. In most cases, it would be a virtual switch that's shared among all the other virtual machines running in production or test on this host, and that virtual switch would also have a connection to the physical network in the data center. However, in some cases, there may be instances where you want virtual machines to just talk to the host, or you just want them to talk to another particular virtual machine, or you don't want them to talk to anyone. Perhaps it's a test virtual machine and you have a duplicate name and IP address to another host that's already on the production infrastructure. It's here, when you create the virtual machine, that you specify where you want this virtual machine to connect to. What type of network configuration do you want it to have? Certainly one option would be to leave it not connected to any network of any kind, or I could take another option here, which is to connect it to the default virtual switch that was created when Hyper-V Server was enabled. Let's go ahead and take that option, and in a future lesson in this course, you'll find out much more about configuring virtual networking and virtual switches later in the course. So here I'll click Next. And now we're presented with information about connecting a virtual hard disk to this new virtual machine. And notice here that we have actually 3 different options. We have create a new virtual hard disk, we can use an existing virtual hard disk, or attach a virtual hard disk later. So if we attach a virtual hard disk later, this is essentially creating a new virtual machine with no hard drive, no local storage. Of course, you can always create one or multiple virtual hard disks later and attach those to the virtual machine. We could also use an existing virtual hard disk. Let's say we had copied one from another computer, or we had downloaded one from the internet. That's not the case here, so we want to actually create a new virtual hard disk. So notice it uses the name here of the virtual machine by default, and then it adds the extension .vhdx, which is the new virtual hard disk format in Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V. Notice it's using the default location that was specified over in the Hyper-V settings, and the size of this virtual hard disk, it says, is 127 gigabytes by default. But notice up here it says that we're going to create a dynamically expanding virtual hard disk. So a dynamically expanding virtual hard disk means that it's going to start out actually very small, nowhere near 127 gigabytes. And then as we install the operating system, it's actually going to inflate and resize that virtual hard disk up until the point that it could get to 127 gigabytes, at which time it would actually run out of space. So 127 gigabytes is just the default, but it's a dynamically expanding hard drive, so it's not going to immediately take up 127 gigabytes out of your Windows Server local hard drive. So it's safe to take the default is what I'm saying here because it's a dynamically expanding virtual hard disk. Of course, also notice here that the maximum size is up to 64 terabytes. That's new with Windows Server 2012. So now let's go down here and click Next. And now we're presented with options to actually install the operating system that we want to install in this virtual machine. So option 1 here is to install an operating system later. Basically that means do nothing. Just create the virtual machine. Don't boot up any installation media for an operating system. We could do that, and then we could start up the virtual machine, attach a virtual CD DVD disk, and then we could boot an operating system that way. But in this case, I've actually already downloaded Windows Server 2012, and that's why I want to go down here and select this option to install an operating system from a boot CD DVD ROM. So we have the choice here to use a physical CD DVD drive, which would be on the Hyper-V server, the physical server. We could select the D drive or whatever drive is the CD DVD media drive, and then we could insert a DVD that we most likely created by downloading, let's say, Windows Server 2012 or Windows 8 Desktop. In this case, I've downloaded the ISO. I don't have to create a DVD and put it in the drive. I've actually got the file. I'll click Browse here, and I put the file over on my desktop. This is actually the ISO file of Windows Server 2012 that I downloaded from Microsoft TechNet. I'll click Open here. And now that we have a ISO file that we're going to boot this new virtual machine from, I'll click Next. We can review what we're about to do here in the summary. We're about to create a new virtual machine named Windows 2012-1 with 4 gigs of RAM. It'll be connected to this network we selected. The new virtual hard drive will be located in this path and will be booting from the ISO file that I specified here. I'll click Finish. It creates the virtual hardware, builds the virtual machine. Right now it's powered off, and all I have to do is go down here and click Start because it's already selected. Notice it says it's starting. Now it's running. I'll just double click it here to open up the console. And as you can see, we're booting up the Windows operating system. And here's the installation screen for Windows Server 2012. Now this installation process is no different than installing it on a physical server. I'll just click Next here. I'll click to Install Now. I'll go down here and select the standard graphical interface, accept the license agreement, do a custom install. There's our 127 gigabyte virtual hard disk that we defined. Of course, this is dynamic, so it's not taking up that much space on our Hyper-V server hard drive. I'll click Enter here. And the installation process begins. Of course, this will take a few minutes, so I'm just going to pause the recording and I'll be right back as soon as this installation process has completed and you can see that we've successfully installed a new virtual machine inside Hyper-V 2012. Okay, the installation of our first virtual machine in Hyper-V has completed here. I'm just going to type in an administrative username, press Enter. It's finalizing our settings, and there we go. Looks like the Windows Server console. It says to press Control-Alt-Delete to sign in. Actually, because this is a virtual machine, I can't quite do that, but I can go up here to Action, and notice it says Control-Alt-Delete, which is the equivalent of Control-Alt-End on the server. Or I can just click here. So if I just click there, notice it's prompting me to log in. I'm logging into the new virtual machine. The virtual machine boots up and it automatically brings up Server Manager, so we can start adding roles on this host to make it into, whatever you want it to be. We can make it into an Active Directory server, DHCP, DNS, Hyper-V, IIS, make it into a web server, Exchange server, file server, whatever you want this new virtual machine to be, it can be. Now there's something else we need to do before we install any applications on this virtual machine, and that is to install the Hyper-V integration services. These are actually tools that are installed inside every virtual machine running underneath Hyper-V, and they increase the performance, the video graphics quality, even your mouse and keyboard functions are improved by having these tools installed. So you want to make sure you have integration services installed. To install integration services, it's very quick and easy. Go up here to the Action menu, go down, and it says Insert Integration Services Setup Disk. I'll click on that. And so this is actually inserting, it's like a virtual DVD into this virtual machine. So here it says a new virtual DVD has been inserted. Tap here to choose what happens to this disk. I'm going to click on it, and I want to say I'll install Hyper-V Integration Services. And it tells us this computer is already running the current version of Integration Services. Well, that's strange. I didn't install it. That's because Integration Services are included in the newer Windows operating systems, in this case, Windows Server 2012. So if it's a Windows Server 2012 virtual machine, you don't need to install Integration Services. However, other operating systems, you need to make sure that you have Integration Services installed. So they're here, even though we didn't install them, and we don't have to worry about installing them, just because this is Windows Server 2012 running as a virtual machine. So I'll say OK there. And let's look at this virtual machine console here, all the different things we can do. Starting from the left on the toolbar here, we've got a button that says Control-Alt-Delete. So if we push that, that's the same as pushing Control-Alt-Delete on a physical server. I can lock it, sign out, change password, task manager, or I can just push Escape and go back to where I was. Up here, the second button is actually Start, but the virtual machine's already running. We've got Turn Off, do a hard power off on this virtual machine. We've got Shutdown, which is a operating system shutdown. It's a gradual shutdown that the operating system is aware of. We've got Save, which is just like putting a laptop to sleep. You can put this server to sleep so that everything in memory is saved to the local hard drive, and then you can resume or start later, as they call it. Then we've got Pause. So if I click Pause, let's find out what happens. There we go. The virtual machine is simply paused. Nothing's happening, but it's still actually running. It's still using up resources on the server. Then I can resume it, and it's back to where it was. We can reset the virtual machine, which is just like pushing the reset button on the front of the server, and then snapshot, which is to take a picture of the virtual machine. Let's say you want to do a snapshot before you do a major application or operating system upgrade. Let's go ahead and do a snapshot right now. I'll just call this Before Upgrade and say yes. If we move this up, notice down here on the bottom it says Snapshot Succeeded. And then notice now here we could click this and we could actually revert and go back to the state of the virtual machine at that time. Now if we go along the toolbar here, the drop down, we've got Settings for the virtual machine, which we'll explore in a little bit. We've got the actions. These are really the same actions we just went through on the toolbar. We've got Media, where we can insert a DVD here. I can insert a new DVD. Basically, if I wanted to install an application, let's say I had an ISO, or I put a physical DVD in the front of the Hyper-V server, then I could connect that DVD to this virtual machine. We also have an option here to use a virtual floppy disk. We've got clipboard and screen capture options here, and then we can go into full screen mode with Control-Alt-Break. So if we close out this virtual machine connection, notice over here, here's the virtual machine we created, Windows 2012-1. It's currently running. It's not using any CPU, nothing's happening. We assigned 4 gigs of memory, and it's been up for 3 minutes and 32 seconds. We can see we did take a snapshot here called Before Upgrade, and then here's some more information down here. We get a summary of it. We can see when it was created, that it does have a heartbeat. That means the integration tools were installed. We get some information here about memory. Dynamic memory is not being used. Networking information, and replication information, which currently isn't configured. Then most of the other options we had on the virtual machine connection are also shown over here to connect to the console, turn off, shut down, save, pause, reset, snapshot, revert. We could move the virtual machine, rename it, or enable replication. All this has to do with the virtual machine, and it's going to change based on the virtual machine I click on. So notice if I click on this one, notice how the options down here changed. But the actions for the Hyper-V host did not change. These are going to stay the same based on the Hyper-V host that you're connected to. All right, with the successful creation of our new virtual machine, let's go back to our slides and talk about various ways to tweak the virtual machine settings. Now that we completed the process of installing our first virtual machine, let's move on and explore some of the virtual machine hardware settings and configurations that you can make. Virtual machines, just like physical servers, have their own virtual BIOS, virtual memory, virtual processors, virtual storage, and virtual networking, all of which is very configurable inside the virtual machine settings hardware section. Additionally, inside the virtual machine settings management section, you'll find configurations related to the integration services, locations, and automatic startup or shutdown. Let's go over to Hyper-V Manager and see how we can tweak the virtual machine settings of our new Hyper-V virtual machine. Back here in Hyper-V Manager, I've selected our virtual machine. I'm just going to go down here and click on Settings. And these are all the different settings that we just got through reviewing back in the slides. So you really have two different sections here. You have a hardware section and a management section. So notice two different sections, hardware and management. So if I expand out hardware, this list here is all the different virtual hardware installed currently on this virtual machine. So we have BIOS, which is good. We need that. We have memory. We have one virtual processor. We have one virtual hard drive, one virtual DVD drive. We have a SCSI controller that we're not currently using. We have a network adapter and a serial port COM1 and serial port COM2 and a virtual floppy drive. Now all this hardware was just created by default when I created the virtual machine. I haven't added any new hardware. I can go here and I can click to add hardware, but notice how these options are grayed out. That's because the virtual machine is currently running. I can't add most hardware when the virtual machine is running. I also cannot modify most things for virtual machines when they are running. For example, the amount of memory. In this case, I can't modify. However, if I was using dynamic memory and I had specific operating systems, then Hyper-V may be able to add memory for me when needed. In other lessons, we'll go into how to modify and tweak things like virtual networking and virtual storage. The most important thing to know is that this is where the virtual resources are assigned to each virtual machine, with the most important resources being virtual memory, virtual CPUs, virtual storage, and virtual networking. Now let's wrap up this hardware here and expand out the management. The management section is where we configure the name of the virtual machine. It's also where we specify information related to integration services. What type of integration services features do we want to offer? The locations for the snapshots related to this virtual machine, the paging file location for the virtual machine, the automatic start action for this virtual machine. Do you want it to automatically start if it was running when Hyper-V stopped, or always start this virtual machine automatically, or do nothing with this virtual machine? We can also set up an automatic stop action here. And that's the management section. So again, hardware and management, these are going to be slightly different for each virtual machine in your Hyper-V virtual infrastructure. And that wraps up this section on how to configure Hyper-V virtual machine settings. Now let's go back to our slides. When I first talked about creating new virtual machines, I said, of course, you can create one from scratch, but another option is to import a virtual machine, either by doing a physical to virtual conversion, or by doing a virtual to virtual conversion, or by actually downloading a virtual machine from the internet. Built into Hyper-V Manager is the Importing a Hyper-V Virtual Machine tool. This wizard will walk you through the process of importing a virtual machine that's already built and configured to run underneath Hyper-V. In other words, it's not already added to your local Hyper-V server. It may have come from another Hyper-V server, or it may have come from a download you did from the internet of a Hyper-V virtual machine. So again, just to reiterate, you would use the Import a Virtual Machine tool to add an existing Hyper-V virtual machine from your local hard drive to your Hyper-V host to be run. Besides the functionality built into Hyper-V Manager, you can also use third-party tools as well as a new tool from Microsoft to import virtual machines either converted from physical servers or from other virtualization hypervisors such as VMware vSphere. For example, in the graphic on the left, you see a third-party tool from Five9.com called Easy Converter, which allows you to convert virtual machines from vSphere into Hyper-V. On the right is a graphic showing Microsoft's new tool called Microsoft Virtual Machine Converter Solution Accelerator, which also allows you to convert virtual machines from VMware vSphere, but it has some additional restrictions. However, both are good options for converting virtual machines from other virtualization platforms. Now let's move on and talk about new virtual machine features available in Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V. In Windows Server 2008 R2, virtual machines were limited to a maximum number of 4 virtual CPUs, or 4 virtual processors, and 64 gigabytes of virtual RAM, or virtual memory. With Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V, Hyper-V host now can go up to 320 logical processors assigned to virtual machines and up to 4 terabytes of physical RAM on the host. Then virtual machines running inside Hyper-V 2012 can have up to 64 virtual processors and up to 1 terabyte of virtual memory. There's also some advanced performance features now offered with Hyper-V 2012, such as NUMA and SR-IOV. These stand for Non-Uniform Memory Access and Single Root I/O Virtualization. I won't go into great detail on how these advanced performance features work, but you should know that they're great for Tier 1 applications that you're trying to virtualize that really need maximum performance out of your Hyper-V host. Also related to virtual machines, there's the new virtual machine disk format, or VHDX, which now supports virtual hard disk up to 64 terabyte in size. It's really amazing the scalability now offered by Microsoft Hyper-V. Before we end the lesson, there's some key terms that you should know. The first one, of course, is virtual machine, or VM. You'll hear me throw around the term VM. Let's power on this VM. Let's access the console of this VM. That's the virtual machine. That's a virtualized server running on the virtual host, also known as the hypervisor. So the host is the hypervisor, and in this case, we're running Hyper-V as our hypervisor. All the virtual machines have virtual hardware, which is the hardware assigned to the virtual machine, such as the processor or the virtual CPU, the virtual memory, the virtual disk, and virtual network interfaces. These are all things you can go and tweak in the virtual machine settings, because as you know, some applications and some operating systems will need more virtual hardware than others. The guest operating system is the operating system loaded and running inside the virtual machine, such as Windows or Linux. You're going to be the one, as the system admin, to load those guest operating systems and, of course, purchase licenses for those if you don't have virtualization rights from Windows Server 2012. A P2V conversion is a physical to virtual conversion, which is really just the process of converting a physical server into a virtual server or a virtual machine running underneath your hypervisor. A V2V is a virtual to virtual conversion, which is just converting a server that's already been virtualized and it's running on one hypervisor, such as VMware vSphere, and you're converting it into, in this case, Microsoft Hyper-V. And finally, the new virtual disk format in Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V is the VHDX file, or Virtual Hard Disk Extended. This is the very large file that you'll see on disk that represents the virtual machine hard drive. Thanks for watching this lesson on creating virtual machines in Hyper-V 2012.